Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos, the servers are down, and I figured this would be a good opportunity to make a video about Mythic Plus changes in War Within. Have they been good? Have they been bad? Which ones have been good and which ones have been bad? Because there have been a lot of Mythic Plus changes coming into this expansion, and recently there's been some, I would say, discontent about Mythic Plus. There was even a protest movement at LFG that's been building a bit over the past couple of days. Now, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that the incoming patch that the servers are currently down for is going to be buffing some overperforming specs in M+, and nerfing some mid and underperforming ones, which is a pretty valid concern and thing to protest. But I think there's also people that are just kind of unhappy with M+ writ large this season. So let's take a look using my favorite format, the tier list. Oh, I can see my face is kind of in the way here. Okay, yeah, the bottom tiers are bad and really bad. Let's see if I can move this and keep it in frame. Perfect. Just what we wanted to see. Okay, so we have a bunch of different things that have changed about M+ this season. I'm going to start with something that's really good, I think, and then we can talk more about some of the changes that have been less than really good. So the first change I want to talk about is the new affixes, Xal'atath's Bargain. This set of affixes, I think there are a few cases where they've been annoying. There are a few bosses where they do weird stuff. There's a few, situations where they felt bad. And on launch, a few of them, like the emissaries, felt pretty bad as well. But they've done a good job of improving the reward for doing the affixes, fixing a lot of the cases where they feel bad. There are still a few bosses, like last week's, Oblivion affix where the orbs come in. There are still some bosses where you kind of feel like, okay, this is sort of like you're fighting the second and third bosses of Arakara, right? And it's like, okay, this just happened to spawn during a time where mechanics really prevented me from being able to realistically soak these, and now the boss has 60% increased damage, and that is still unfortunate. But I think when we compare these affixes to Sanguine, Bolstering, all those old affixes that we used to have, like, this is really good, and is making the season a lot more fun than if the old affixes had been in that spot. So I think that is a clear, really good thing, for me at least, this season. Now, continuing the theme of affixes, I think one thing that's been really bad has been Challenger's Peril. I don't think this is accomplishing anything good at all. So this is the thing where in 7 and higher keys, you're now taking double or triple time loss, right? 15 seconds instead of 5 from a death. Really unfortunate, I think, addition to the game. I think they felt like they needed to add more affixes at more levels and more difficulty and stuff, but I really think that M+, where one wipe equals a key depleted, is the least fun way to play M+, and Challenger's Peril moves that level down lower. It moves it into those pug keys that you can be doing, and I think that's just a tragic removal of fun from what otherwise could be a pretty fun season. So I think this is actually a lot of problems in pugs and stuff come from the fact that the success rate is lower this season, and a lot of the success rate being lower this season comes from Challenger's Peril existing, and a lot of unfun M+ keys that you do time are because you just have to play them so safely and so conservatively because Challenger's Peril exists. So I think this is really a contagion in the M+ affix list. I think that if this expansion they had taken away the 5-second death penalty instead and didn't add Challenger's Peril, I think that would probably make keys that probably fixes 50% of the total bad feeling around keys this season, although there are some other changes and stuff that we should get to. But first, our video sponsor for today is once again Pure Kick Energy. So this is it's an energy drink mix thing. So you get water, and then you get these mix packets, put it in the water. The best one is grape. The grape is the best one, the Concord grape. I have had all of them that they sent me. Those are all gone now, so that's unfortunate. May have to get some more. But they also are currently doing a promo with Warcraft Rumble. So if you are playing Warcraft Rumble, you can get some free stuff when you order things up until the end of the year, it looks like. So if you're a Warcraft Rumbler, and even if I've got some extra codes that they sent me too. So if you want to try and yoink these, if you're one of the first people watching this video, there's one, and there's another, and yeah, this is the 1080p tax. If you're not on 1080p, you're going to have a hard time getting these codes. There's another, and there's the last one. There's some Rumble codes, so enjoy those. Thank you, Pure Kick, for sponsoring this video, and Keep up the good work, especially on the grape flavor. Again, that one is the best one by a lot. It's so good. Okay. All right. Next thing, another affix that got added this time around was Xal'atath's Guile. So this was a cool idea. This was a cool idea for high keys, where it's like, okay, we are going to turn off affixes at high keys, and every single week, every single experience in a high key is going to be the same, right? You're going to have the same set of affixes every single week in every key level 12 or higher. I think that was a good idea, particularly in a world where the affixes sucked, which was the world that these were all being designed in. And I do think that it's maybe a little bit less necessary, because I think Xal'atath's bargain affixes are actually pretty fun. And I think they get more fun in a more min-max environment, right? Like, you know, doing Oblivion Orbs. Obviously, there's a couple of bosses that it kind of feels unfair on. But aside from that, you know, the better the group is, the more coordinated the group is, the more you can actually soak all 10, the more you can maybe try and delay soaking the 10th and roll the stacks, and that's fun. The more that you can try and, like, use it to make a pull doable or a boss with Lust, you know, and the buff better. And that's true for all the Xal'atath's bargain affixes. So I actually think that they would maybe be pretty fun to min-max in high keys. They'd maybe have this issue of some being way better than others, depending on the week, right? Like some that are less punishing to do. Like you don't have to sink damage into Void Emissaries, for instance. Void Emissaries, I think, can still be one of the ones that's more punishing, although it has a pretty good upside now when you actually do complete it. So maybe that would actually be one of the better ones. I don't know. So I could see that being an argument for, like, okay, maybe these make the weeks 2 key levels different from each other in terms of what you can do. Although it doesn't feel that way in the 10s. They all feel fairly balanced in the 10s. So either way, I guess my point is I'm not sure Xal'atath's Guile is actually needed with how fun Xal'atath's bargains are. Xal'atath's Guile also came at the start of the season with like a 20% health and damage increase to mobs. Now they've nerfed that to 10%. I still think it's unnecessary to have such a canyon between 11s and 12s. I think that creates there just doesn't need to be such a steep difficulty curve between the two of those. So I do think that Xal'atath's Guile should still have that removed. I'm going to put it in ambivalent or mid. Not mid, but ambivalent. Like I'm not sure. This is doing some things I like and some things I don't like, and I also haven't done enough high keys this season to have a really good opinion on if Xal'atath's Guile is something that I'd want to see more often or see continued. I think I'd like to see them experiment next season without it and just see what it's like to have the bargains in the high keys, and then we could kind of see which was better. That I think would be what I'd like to see tried. But again, this is one of those things where it's like, unlike Challenger's Peril, I don't think this is like clearly bad. I think there's definitely pros and cons to the Xal'atath's Guile. Okay, another thing that changed about M+ sort of last season in Dragonflight, but then in this season sort of for real for the first time, was the key level squish. The increase in difficulty to M0, the increase in difficulty of M+ by, they say, about 10 key levels. I think it's probably more like 7 or 8, but either way, it's, you know, keys, what used to be a 12 is now 2, right? Or what used to be a 10, I think, is now 2. So I don't know, the keys got harder, basically, right? And it's like, now to do the highest level keys for rewards, you're doing 10s instead of 20s. And all of those keys from 2 to 10 or whatever basically got lobbed off the ecosystem. And I actually think I originally would have thought that this would have been an unimpactful change that didn't matter, because it didn't change the relative. There are people that think it made the gap between key levels bigger. It actually doesn't do that. They didn't change the relative scaling there. Like the slope didn't change. They just changed where we started, right? Where the y-intercept was on that graph, right? So that didn't actually get affected, right? The gap between a 2 and a 3 should be the same as the old gap between a 12 and a 13. It's not like it's a bigger gap. It's not like they increased the exponential scaling between the key levels. It's still the same percent bigger than it used to be. Now, is that a good thing? I actually think it's probably been bad. I think that the key squish and removal of the old 2 to 10s, I think there were a lot of people that did keys in the 2 to 10 range in Dragonflight that had fun doing it, that are now kind of bashing their heads against, say, the 5 key level range. And that is really, I don't think they just needed to remove that. I don't know. I don't think that it was bad to have more key levels in the game and to have M+ reach down to a lower portion of the game. One thing that they sort of justified it with was we're going to make M0 and heroic dungeons are going to be what M0s used to be. M0s are going to kind of be like the low keys, but they're untimed. And I think they've done a pretty poor job of accomplishing that. I will admit this is not an ecosystem that I'm super involved with. Like, I don't do those keys, and I don't hang out with people that do that much. But, I will say there have been people in my chat in previous seasons that talk about being, the people that do +5 keys, right, in previous expansions. And I don't have anybody in my chat that really talks about how they do M0s. Now, it's possible that section of the player base is just migrated to delves instead. But I just get the sense that something has been lost and nothing has been gained by removing those low keys. I do think something could be gained if we made M0s sort of like interesting, challenging, hard mode level stuff where it's like, oh, this is kind of as hard as a +8 key and as rewarding as a +8 key, crucially, but not timed. So I think that's been bad. I think that the key level squish has actually been bad. I'm going to change my font size down a little bit so I have space to fit everything in here, because there's actually a lot of changes that came with M+ here. The other thing that sort of ties in with the key level squish is the rewards. Those two things are sort of intertwined, right? When we talk about 10s being harder than 20s or whatever it used to be, like a crucial factor is what level they choose to put different rewards at. And so two things have changed this time around compared to Dragonflight. One is that the key level you have to go to for the best rewards has, in my opinion, gotten somewhat harder to execute. It's harder, I think, to time a 10 or to complete a 10 than it was to complete the highest level of keys that gave relevant rewards, right? That gave relevant power level rewards in previous patches and previous expansions. And tied in with that, they've also just nerfed the rewards across the board from M+ by a key level or two. They walked this back a little bit, right? They added Gilded Crests to 8s instead of 9s, but they haven't fully walked this back. It's definitely still true that, you're only getting Myth 1 out of 6 gear from doing a 10, or from putting a 10 into your vault, right? There's no more access to Myth 2 gear in your vault. There's only, you have to go to the very highest key level to even get Myth gear at all. And that's sort of true all the way down, even reaching into M0s, where just the gear is, I would say, like 1 or 2 steps worse than it feels like it would have been if we were trying to maintain the same effort to reward ratio that M+ had in previous expansions. And I think that that's probably a bad thing again as well. Like, I think that M+ gear being like that is... I think that there was a goal to make raid more appealing, and they did some good stuff to buff raid gear. You look at stuff like Heroic, the last 2 bosses dropping Gilded Crest, I think that's fantastic. And the Heroic raid feels rewarding, feels like a good use of your time. That's great. But I don't think that M+ needed to... M+ sort of feels like a... It feels like a lot of work for not a lot of rewards to do M+. And in order for M+ gear to be better than Delve gear, you have to do such hard keys versus doing such easy delves. And I think that's a mistake. I think you should be able to, I think you should be able to go in and do a low-level key and get similar gear to doing a high-level delve, rather than having to go in and do a high-level key to get better gear than a high-level delve. So, yeah, there's two different changes, right? The difficulty change, like the difficulty of the highest keys for reward, and just the gear nerfs in general. I'm going to put both of those into bad tier. I don't think they're, like... Well, maybe I should put them into really bad tier. I don't know. I mean, I do think that they... I can see what was being attempted here. I think there's definitely some merit to the idea behind these, but I do think they've worked out badly. I'll put them in bad rather than really bad, because I don't think they're... I think Challenger's Peril is just a straight-up blunder, so... Difficulty / gear nerfs. We'll just put them both here. Bang. Okay. Up next is the dungeon pool. So going into this season, I would have guessed that I would be putting the dungeon pool into the really bad tier. Siege of Borealis didn't like. Grim Batol did not look promising. Mists, I always thought was kind of mid. Necrotic Wake I really didn't like. And then the set of War Within dungeons that were coming in, I and a lot of people were really worried about Dawnbreaker. And the other ones also looked, it's okay. I will say that I've been pleasantly surprised about a few dungeons I was worried about, and disappointed by a few dungeons I was excited about. So City of Threads, for instance, not a dungeon I've actually had a lot of fun playing, despite the fact that it looked pretty fun in beta and PTR. Dawnbreaker, a dungeon that actually I quite like. I like Dawnbreaker quite a bit. I think they nerfed a lot of the damage in Dawnbreaker to the point because they were worried about everybody hating it, and that turned it into the easiest dungeon in the pool. And it turns out, hey, the easiest dungeon in a pool that's because of the difficulty in gear being a pain point this season, you're farming keys at a level where they're quite tough for you, kind of by necessity, because that's where the good rewards are. And that means that the key that's the easiest actually is a lot more fun this season, right? It's like those seasons where there were junkyards and mists and freeholds and stuff, like those easy dungeons relative to the other ones. If you were playing at a key level that was hard in some dungeons and easy in the easy dungeons, those easy dungeons were a lot more fun for you in the farming process, the gear farming, when you're doing keys to farm gear rather than to push score. When you're doing keys to push score, the existence of a difficulty imbalance between dungeons usually just creates negative things for your experience. But for farming gear, it makes you have a quite positive association with the easy and fun keys. So yeah, Dawnbreaker, I like what they did to the difficulty of that dungeon. I wish they'd do that to all the dungeons' difficulties, make them all as hard as Dawnbreaker, and probably even still a key level easier than that. Mists is okay. The maze always takes the wind out of my sails in the mists. But the rest of the dungeon, I don't know, is fine. Siege still absolute garbage dungeon, disaster place. And then places like Grim Batol and Arakara, I don't know. I have other problems with them, and that'll be the next category we talk about. So I'm gonna put the dungeon pool in bad. I'm not as low as I would have guessed I would have been. Like, I think the dungeon pool is bad. I don't think it's the key problem with this season. I think that it's not in the really bad tier. I don't diagnose it as one of the biggest, most unforced errors like I kind of expected I would. I think they've done a decently good job of making the dungeons actually reasonably good in a lot of these cases. But they were working with, putting Siege of Brawl, for whatever reason they chose to put Siege of Bralis into this dungeon pool. That's always going to be a head scratcher for me. I don't understand what they were up to with that. But they did make it a lot better. They made it a lot better. It still sucks. Necrotic Wake they made a lot better, and it's still mid at best. But if they had started with some already good dungeons and then done this level of improvement to them, they would have been all-time bangers, right? Instead, they started with some of the worst dungeons in my opinion and made them mid, which is okay, I guess good work, but you didn't have to do that work. You could have just started with better dungeons. But one of the things about dungeon pool is it's a very subjective thing, right? So, but speaking of my problems with Grim Batol and Arakara, those dungeons have an awful lot of poison or curse dispels, and I think that is not good. I think that so they already nerfed the Grim Batol curses, but I think that when we look at these curses and poisons in these dungeons, they do way too much damage for something that you can't always dispel, that your group can't always dispel, and it really pressures comps into homogenizing down to ones that have access to one or even multiple dispels for these sorts of effects. It punishes the healers that don't have the right dispel in these dungeons as well, and I think that is really bad. So I think poisons / curses. I think if they want poisons and curses to be this impact or to be like this, there's two solutions for this. Either just make poisons and curses do 30% of the damage they currently do, so that it's not that bad if you can't get rid of them that way, right? If my answer is 7 healer globals to heal the poison, or 1 global from somebody with a poison dispel, that's a disaster, I think. If the choice is 2.5 healer globals versus 1 poison dispel global, that's something I'm much more okay with, and I think that is something that was a mistake with how they implemented these poisons and curses. The other change that they could do is they could make these dispels dispellable by poison or magic, right? Or curse or magic, right? And in that case, your healer can still just always dispel them, and then you get the bonus effect of anybody with a curse spell can dispel too. And I think that could be a cool thing for them to try with poisons and curses and diseases and stuff going forward. And maybe you have 2 of them go out and they're hitting a little bit less hard than they currently are, and every healer can dispel 1 guaranteed, and then also some DPS have the off dispel for it. And it's it's good if you have 1, but it's not disastrous if you don't. That kind of thing could be a way to try and make this move out of the really bad tier. You could also just not do them. That's also a fine option. Nobody ever looks at a dungeon and is yeah, you know what that dungeon was missing? I was missing some diseases. I really wish that this dungeon had some diseases or poisons. Nobody has ever said that about a dungeon in the history of World of Warcraft. Okay. Another change that came in this time around was the kick and stop change. So this change is basically now if you stun a mob, if you knock it, if you do anything to it besides interrupting its cast, it does not, the spell that it was casting does not go on cooldown, and it immediately starts recasting. Now, Blizzard said this was to make the rule set of World of Warcraft more consistent between different modes, right? When a player gets stunned, the spell they were casting doesn't go on CD, they can cast it again out of their stun, and they wanted mobs and M+ to work that way as well. I sort of understand that reasoning, but I'm still in this case of like, but why though? M+ is a place where there's definitely a lot of stuff that you kind of have to learn how it works, and that's a little bit different than how the rest of the game works. And I think one of the good places of that was the kicks and was stopping mobs. Like you see the mob casting its important spell, you hit it with a stun, and that's like a good counterplay. That's a good instinct for somebody to have. It's a fun, rewarding counterplay for the dungeon. And I think the removal of it was really bad. I think that the fact now that if you stun a mob, like if you see a mob is about to get a dangerous cast off and you're like, oh, I'm going to save the day, and you stun it, and the only person in your group who had a kick also tried to kick at the same time as you tried to stun, and it just doesn't go on CD now, and it comes out and it starts casting again, and now you have to like juggle stops on the pack. It makes these stops as well. Like if your group has 5 AoE stops, you can juggle stops on a mob until you get to your next kick, whereas if it doesn't, you don't anymore. So one of their stated goals there was to make the difference between groups that have a lot of AoE stops and ones that don't a smaller difference, but in a lot of cases it feels like it's actually bigger now, because instead of using 1 AoE stop to handle something, you can now use 5 instead. And it's like, okay, well, some groups still do have 5, and that actually is still an option for those groups, but it's not for the groups that just have 1. So I think this has been a really bad change. I would love to see this one reverted, and I think M+, one of the sleeper, less fun things for me in M+ this season is definitely the fact that that doesn't work anymore. And anytime you ever munch somebody's kick or somebody munches your kick, it just feels like such a calamity, and it happens more often in the pugs, and the pug situation is one that I think is in the most dire straits right now. So yeah, the kick/stop change goes in the really bad tier for me. Okay, another change that got made for M+ this season was tank durability nerfs. This was an interesting one at the end of beta. You also have to be tough looking at like beta changes, because they nerfed tanks relative to how tanks were in beta. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are nerfing tanks relative to how tanks were at the time in Dragonflight, for instance. It turns out they were, but oftentimes when they make changes like that, that's not what they're like. You know, calling those things buffs and nerfs is a little bit weird because the content is unreleased, and I think people sometimes, if you call it that, will think that you're talking about it relative to the released content, like when we're talking about difficulty and gear nerfs, where it is relative to previous season. But it does have it does turn out that tanks actually are just squishier against auto attacks, against sustained incoming damage than they used to be. The sustained incoming damage side of things was Blizzard's idea, right? Their idea was like, we would like tanks living to be more of a partnership between a tank and a healer. We would like the tank to rely on the healer to live a lot of incoming damage that is kind of smoother over time. It doesn't feel smoother over time. It just feels like more damage, and it feels like a lot of tanks just don't have the kit to deal with that. And some tanks do, right? Like if you're playing a Prot Warrior, you can hold up your shield, you can actually live 10 auto attacks. If you're playing a Demon Hunter or a Brewmaster, you better have CDs or you better kite, because otherwise you are going to die to those auto attacks. So I think that has made the amount of tanks who can do that, combined with like Challenger's Peril, has made the prospect of tanking a pug key extremely sketch. The process of, it's made those sorts of things more punishing, I think more toxic as well. Again, that sort of difficulty existing, a tank flopping, people get really mean to tanks when that happens, and tanking is already a hard and thankless job, and I don't think it needed to get harder and thanklesser. So I think that was also a bad thing that they did. I'll put it in the really bad tier. I don't think there was much merit to it. I think that one of the good things is that it does mean now, a good healer plus a bad tank is maybe a little bit better of a combo than it used to be in Dragonflight, right? Like in Dragonflight, your healer basically was not involved at all in whether your tank lived or died, and now a good healer can maybe have some more agency over whether their tank lives and dies, which maybe that's enough of a good side effect of this to move it straight up into the bad tier. Yeah, I don't want to just put everything into the really bad tier, and I do think that this one at least does have some of that upside, right? Like splitting some of the weight between the tank and the healer. The problem is, like, those jobs are already both really hard. Healer was already really hard without this in a pug situation, although kind of easy in a coordinated group situation. And depending on the coordinated group, as you get really high, then it gets really hard again. But you know, if you're trying to do like a title push and you're telling me you got your worst player, what should they be on? It's like Aug or healer for sure, in my opinion, versus the other stuff. Yeah. So again, there were some slight upsides to this. There were some benefits to this, but I think tank, durability, nerf. I'm gonna put this in the bad section here. And this is kind of, I'm gonna just put some lines here between some of these. Yeah. Ooh. Just do some lines so that these different concepts are nice and separated from each other. There. Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful tier list here. You can see what happens when there's not a tier maker for whatever I'm making a tier list for. Okay. Then that brings us to class balance. Class balance this season, I think, is getting a lot of flack. I actually think it's quite good compared to a lot of previous seasons. Like, okay, let's pop open Raider.io. So if we look at the, top runs, we got, what, 4 different tanks on the front page, 2 different healers. Healer balance, I think, is definitely the one that's in the worst place. And we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are all frost, okay. 7. These are all enhance. Yeah, we got 7 different specs on the front page for DPS. It's not the most, but it's also definitely not the least. And in terms of like DPS representation at say 10 and up, this is pretty good. It's not as good as Dragonflight Season 1, but I would say it's actually pretty good. Now, they've been making some changes that I think are fair to describe as bad. Like, I think balance is getting worse going into patch 11.0.5. In my video talking about the changes, right, I talked about how, Fury definitely could maybe still get a nerf to the situations it's really good in, but it definitely needs some compensation buffs for, say, single target, for probably, targeting them by AoE capping them rather than by lowering their AoE burst and just buffing their sustained even AoE and sustained single target for sure, is kind of a mistake. And it feels like some specs are getting treated with the kitty gloves and some are getting hit really hard. Some specs are getting buffed that are already really good. So I will say, I think balance up to this point has actually been good. I think they've been making mostly good changes and a few mistakes to balance. And I think that the season has been pretty fun. It's been one of the ones where, like, yeah, there's a couple of clear OP specs. I think healer balance, like if we were just talking about healer balance, that's probably in the bad or really bad tier up to this point. I do think that the 11.0.5 initial offering of balance does look really bad. That looks like something where we are in need of some targeted buffs and nerfs to specs that are going to massively over and underperform an M+ over the next couple of weeks. And I think if we don't get that, we are going to see the top of the leaderboard become much more monochrome than it already is, which would be a shame. So 11.0.5 initial tuning. I'm going to put that into really bad tier. Now, again, the 11.0.5 initial tuning isn't about M+, right? Like, a lot of the reason specs are getting better or worse is because they're kind of doing reworky stuff to specs. And I think what's happened is, incidentally, some of the reworked trees they've added for already good specs have been effective buffs to them. And some of the ones they've done for mid or bad specs have been effectively nerfs to them. But I don't think that they were trying to do that, hopefully. So there is definitely still time for them to fix this. This is not a death sentence to the season. This is something that's very easy for them to fix with hotfix level changes, right? These problems, like Challenger's Peril, I guess, could also be done in a weekly fix or in a hotfix fix, but like Poisons and Curses, these are a lot more work. These would require some philosophical changes for them to fix, whereas this is something that they very likely will fix over the next couple of weeks, but I am still going to put it into the really bad tier for right now. Okay. So that's my list of things this M+ season. You can see a lot of stuff has wound up in the bad and really bad tiers. I think the good news here, the grain of salt, the silver lining. I don't think grain of salt is really at all what this is. The silver lining to take from this is by far the biggest most ambitious change made to M+ in this list. And I think it was and is really good, and it's received improvements to move it. Like, probably the launch version of this would have been maybe down here, and they made some buffs to it and some changes, and then they made some more, and now it's up here. And that's great. Xal'atath's Guile would have started out in the really bad tier, and they moved it up to mid, or ambivalent, right? Like, I can see it being good and bad. So there are good things happening in some of these spaces, and I'm hopeful that they will think about doing some more good changes to some of the rest of this stuff. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Please try and stay civil and nice to each other, especially other commenters. Please try not to, like, so people have a lot of different opinions about this kind of stuff. Do not be a jerk to anybody in the comment section, or I will mute you from the channel, so don't do that. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Bye.